The laptop screen glowed at 2:14 a.m., casting a pale blue light across Daniel Cross's face as he sat alone in his home office, finger hovering over the trackpad. He'd installed the camera in his twin brother's room 9 days ago, convinced someone on the overnight care staff was mishandling him. What he saw instead made his breath catch in his throat. On the grainy feed, the night maid, Elena Duarte, was kneeling beside Michael's bed, not adjusting his pillows, not checking his monitors, but pressing her palm firmly against the sole of his foot, whispering something Daniel couldn't hear, and waiting. Michael's toe twitched, just barely. Daniel rewound the footage 3 times to be sure his eyes weren't lying to him. His brother hadn't moved anything below his chest in 6 years. Daniel, 44, had co-founded a fintech company that processed $40 billion in annual transactions before its 2019 acquisition for $2.6 billion, making him, at the time, one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the payments sector. He spent $46,000 a month on Michael's round-the-clock medical care, specialists, equipment, a private nursing rotation, yet had never once in 6 years seen a single flicker of movement doctors hadn't already told him was medically impossible. Money had built Michael a room with the best hospital bed available and a ceiling lift system that cost more than most homes. It had never once made his brother's foot move. 6 years earlier, on October 3rd, Daniel and Michael had been driving home from their father's funeral when a delivery truck ran a red light, striking the passenger side where Michael sat. Daniel walked away with a fractured wrist. Michael was diagnosed with a complete T4 spinal cord injury, a classification meaning, according to the treating neurologist at the time, a less than 1% probability of any voluntary movement returning below the injury site. What almost no one outside the family knew was that Daniel had been driving. He had carried that detail the way some men carry debt, quietly, compounding interest, never spoken aloud. Elena Duarte, 52, had worked in Daniel's household for 3 years, hired through an agency after the third overnight aide in 18 months, quit citing burnout. Her personnel file listed her prior experience simply as caregiver 14 years. What it didn't list, because no one had asked, was that Elena had spent those 14 years as a licensed rehabilitation nurse in a public hospital system overseas, a credential that, upon immigrating 9 years ago, wasn't recognized by any U.S. state board without a recertification process costing $23,000 and requiring nearly 2 years. She couldn't afford to take unpaid. She earned $17.50 an hour, turning Michael every 2 hours through the night, a fraction of what her training was worth in a country that had never asked what she used to know. 3 weeks before he installed the camera, Daniel's household accountant flagged a discrepancy. $40 to $60 unaccounted for weekly from the care budget's petty cash going back nearly 8 months. Daniel assumed theft. He nearly terminated Elena's contract on the accountant's recommendation alone, stopping only because his assistant suggested reviewing footage first to be certain. What the footage would eventually reveal wasn't theft. It was Elena quietly purchasing used resistance bands, a second-hand vibration platform, and printed research packets from a rehabilitation science journal she'd kept a subscription to for 11 years, using her own judgment and the family's forgotten cash to fund something no one had authorized. Night after night, the footage showed the same pattern. Elena arriving 45 minutes before her official shift began, working through a sequence of passive movements and pressure point stimulation on Michael's feet and calves that matched, almost exactly, a neuroplasticity-based rehabilitation protocol published in a 2021 clinical study on incomplete spinal injuries, a protocol Michael's own medical team had never mentioned because his chart had never been reclassified as a candidate for it. Elena had noticed something during a routine turn 8 months earlier, a barely perceptible resistance in Michael's left foot when she repositioned it. the kind of subtle response a rushed 12-minute care visit from a rotating specialist would never catch, but a caregiver present for 1,000 plus hours across 3 years might. She hadn't told Daniel. She told herself she needed to be certain first. She'd seen hope offered carelessly before in the hospital she'd once worked in, and had watched what false hope did to families who couldn't afford to lose it twice. Daniel confronted her the next morning, laptop open on the kitchen counter, the footage paused on her kneeling by Michael's bed. Her trembling voice carried something Daniel didn't expect. Not fear of being caught, but the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying a secret she couldn't yet prove. "I wasn't trying to hide it from you," she said. "I was trying not to give you something to hope for until I knew it was real." Daniel realized, standing there, that he'd been one accusation away from firing the only person in 6 years who had looked at his brother and seen something other than a diagnosis. Daniel flew in Dr. Priya Nandakumar, a neurorehabilitation specialist from a top 15 ranked research hospital, at a consultation cost of $18,000 for the visit alone. After 72 hours of testing, her assessment stunned the family. Michael's injury, based on updated imaging, showed characteristics more consistent with an incomplete spinal cord injury than the original complete classification, a distinction the original 2018 scan technology may have been too limited to detect precisely, and one that changes prognosis dramatically. Dr. Nandakumar estimated fewer than 200 documented cases nationally of reclassification this many years post-injury, largely because most patients never receive the kind of sustained, informal daily stimulation Elena had been providing without pay, permission, or protocol. That evening, using the eye-tracking communication device he'd relied on for years, Michael spelled out a sentence to Daniel that neither of them had spoken since the funeral 6 years earlier. "I know you were driving. I forgave you in the hospital. You never let me tell you." Daniel sat on the floor beside his brother's bed and, for the first time since the accident, allowed himself to cry in front of him, not from the movement in Michael's foot, but from the 6 years he'd spent punishing himself for something his brother had released almost immediately. Daniel admitted haltingly that the $46,000 a month hadn't only been about care, it had been penance, an unconscious belief that if he spent enough, hired enough specialists, built an elaborate enough system around his brother, he could outrun the guilt of a green light he still saw when he closed his eyes. Elena, still standing quietly near the doorway, said the thing that reframed everything. Money kept him alive comfortably. It never once tried to help him get better. That takes attention, not funding. Within 2 weeks, Dr. Nandakumar formally added Elena's protocol to Michael's official treatment plan, crediting her observations in the clinical notes, an almost unheard of acknowledgement for an unlicensed caregiver in a hospital system, but one Dr. Nandakumar insisted on including, calling Elena's sustained observation more clinically valuable than most of the specialist visits in this file. Daniel covered the full $23,000 cost of Elena's nursing recertification, along with 18 months of paid leave at her full salary, so she could complete it without financial strain, something she'd been unable to arrange alone for 9 years. He also created a formal, salaried position, lead rehabilitation coordinator, at a compensation package 4 times her prior hourly rate, making her the first non-family member in the Cross household's history to hold a titled clinical role rather than a domestic one. 6 months later, Daniel and Elena co-launched the Duarte Cross Initiative, a foundation providing recertification funding for foreign-trained nurses and rehabilitation specialists working in the U.S. as caregivers or domestic staff, a population numbering by one nonprofit's estimate over 1.4 million nationally, most earning wages far below their clinical training's value. The foundation funded its first 22 recertifications within its opening year. Each recipient identified specifically because, like Elena, they'd been quietly practicing clinical judgment no one had thought to ask about. Michael's recovery remained slow and far from complete. Doctors describe his prognosis now as cautiously reclassified, not cured, with continued gains measured in millimeters of movement over months, not miracles over days. But he can, as of this year, move 3 toes and flex his left. Ankle independently, a milestone his medical team once ranked below 1% probability. Daniel no longer measures his brother's progress against the wealth he can throw at it. He measures it against the 1,000 hours Elena spent noticing what 6 specialists, 12 visits, and 1 very expensive care system had all somehow missed. Proof that the rarest resource in that house was never money. It was someone willing to keep watching, long after everyone else had stopped expecting anything to change.